married man goes duck hunting on a lake and never comes back. Everyone says the alligators got him. Everyone says the body can never be found. But one mother can't accept it. 17 years, 2,600 letters, and one mother's stubborn refusal to give up. And then one day, the entire story turns upside down. This isn't just a disappearance. It's a tale of friendship, betrayal, greed, and murder that will shake you to your core. Hello everyone, I'm Adam, and you're watching Who Was, where we bring you the world's most complicated and heartbreaking true crime cases. Today's story is from the small town of Tallahassee, Florida, where a successful real estate appraiser named Mike Williams suddenly vanishes. Officially, it's said that he drowned or fell victim to alligators, but his mother, Cheryl Williams, refuses to accept this. This is the story of a mother's unyielding determination, a best friend's betrayal, a wife's chilling silence, and finally, the truth that surfaces from the ground 17 years later. If you're a true crime fan, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because today's story is one you won't forget. Let's begin. Jerry Michael Williams, affectionately known to everyone as Mike, was born on October 16, 1969, in Bradfordville, North Florida. The family didn't have much money. His father was a bus driver and his mother a kindergarten teacher. Mike and his older brother grew up living in a trailer, but despite the poverty, there was no shortage of love and hard work in this household. Instead of building their own house, the parents began saving money for their children's education, and Mike and his brother worked part-time at a supermarket at night to lighten the family's burden. Mike enrolled at North Florida Christian High School, and it was there that his personality began to blossom. He became student council president, played on the soccer team, and was active in the Key Club, meaning he wasn't just an average student, but a natural leader whom people liked. At just 15 years old, he took up duck hunting, a hobby that would later become one of the most important parts of his life, and sadly, also the cause of his death. It was around this age that Mike met Denise Merrill. Denise was a cheerleader and secretary of the student council, meaning these two were the school's ultimate power couple. Friends would look at them and say these two were made for each other. Meanwhile, Mike became friends with Brian Winchester, whom Denise herself had introduced them to. So all three of them were connected to one another since childhood, and no one had any idea how terrifying this friendship would eventually become. Time passed. Brian met Kathy Thomas, and now four people, Mike, Denise, Brian, and Kathy, became a tight-knit group. They all hung out together, traveled together, attended parties together. After high school, Mike and Denise enrolled at Florida State University, where Mike studied political science and urban planning. Both graduated. Denise became a public accountant, and Mike a real estate appraiser. In 1994, the two got married, and around the same time, Brian and Kathy also tied the knot. Mike was a very hard-working person. He'd work 15 hours a day, trying to take his career to new heights. By the age of 31, he was earning roughly $200,000 a year, which was an incredible income in Florida at the time. He and Denise bought a house in a nice upscale neighborhood, and in 1999, their daughter was born, named Ansley. From the outside, this looked like the picture of a perfect American family: a successful husband, a beautiful wife, an adorable daughter, and a best friend who always stood by their side. But as often happens, sometimes the picture that looks the most beautiful hides the deepest darkness behind it. Because within this very perfect group, something had begun years earlier that would eventually cost Mike Williams his life. But when did this darkness begin? Let's move to the turning point where friendship's path turned toward betrayal. The most devastating turning point of the story comes in 1997, when Brian Winchester finds a note in his wife Kathy's purse and discovers that Kathy is cheating on him. Anger and a desire for revenge ignite inside Brian. In his own words, "I wanted revenge." This was the pain of a man who, in his loneliness and anger, began looking toward others. Around this time, Brian and Denise's friendship, which went back to childhood, takes a new turn. Brian says he had never been attracted to Denise before, but after Kathy's betrayal, he began looking at other women differently. Then, in October 1997, at a rock concert, drunk, Brian and Denise grow close. What started as one night quickly turns into a regular secret affair. They would meet in hotels during office hours, whenever the chance arose. As Brian put it, whenever we got the chance, we'd meet. But it wasn't just physical. Denise and Brian began exchanging gifts and writing love letters. The two started thinking of themselves as a couple, as if they had built an entire other world outside their real lives. But for Denise, there was a problem. Her pious image in society, her reputation for being simple and pure, mattered a great deal to her. She never wanted to divorce her husband Mike because it would damage her social standing and she'd have to share custody of her daughter. Brian, too, didn't want to leave Kathy. Both knew this affair couldn't end, but both also knew there was no easy solution. Divorce was not acceptable to either of them. During this same period, an incident occurs that would later prove to be perhaps the most ironic turning point of fate. Mike nearly dies in a hunting accident, and the one who saves him is none other than Brian Winchester himself. After this incident, an idea is born in Denise's mind, a path that might be the solution to their problem. This idea was so terrifying that perhaps even Denise herself didn't fully understand at the time where it was leading her. Around this time, Mike, always concerned about his family's welfare, buys 2 insurance policies from his friend and insurance agent Brian, worth $250,000 and $500,000. In 2000, Mike's father passes away, and after this shock, Mike becomes even more concerned about his family's financial security. He goes back to Brian, and this time takes out a $1 million policy. So now, just 6 months before his death, Mike's life was insured for nearly $2 million, an amount that would later become the foundation of this entire story. Now friendship, betrayal, and money were all moving together toward a plan whose outcome no one could have imagined. The morning of December 16, 2000, Mike and Denise's 6th wedding anniversary.
Authorities believed Mike was eaten by alligators after falling out of his boat while duck hunting.
According to Denise, Mike got up early that morning and went duck hunting at Lake Seminole. The plan was that he'd be back by afternoon, and that night the two would celebrate their anniversary in the small town of Apalachicola. But the afternoon passed, and Mike didn't come back. Denise grew worried. She called her father, who called Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester. Brian and his father-in-law immediately headed to Lake Seminole. There they found Mike's Ford Bronco parked near the boat dock, but Mike himself was nowhere to be seen. They went to all the places where Mike usually hunted, but neither Mike nor his boat could be found. Police were notified, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency's investigation team began a search. A few hours later, a helicopter pilot spotted Mike's boat, drifting in the water about 225 feet from the boat ramp. The boat was searched, and Mike's shotgun was found still locked in its case, as if it had never been used. Now the search operation had become a rescue mission. Locals said this lake used to be an orchard, and when a dam was built across 3 rivers, this very orchard turned into a reservoir, which is why the lake was named Stump Field, because so many stumps stuck out of the water and land. Searchers guessed that maybe Mike's boat had hit a stump and he'd fallen into the water, and his waders had filled with water and dragged him down. Various agencies joined the search. A dive team was even called in from Montgomery, Alabama, but every effort failed. Mike was nowhere to be found. A week passed, and now the rescue operation had turned into a body search. Divers probed the lake bottom with poles. Dogs were brought in, but only a camouflage hunting cap was found, which couldn't be linked to Mike. Officials eventually declared that Mike had likely been eaten by alligators, since no signs of violent death were found either. 5 weeks later, the search was called off, and the very next day, Denise held Mike's memorial service. But for a mother, this story couldn't end so easily. There was a question in Cheryl Williams's heart that wouldn't let her rest. Within just 2 months, the world had accepted that Mike Williams was no longer alive. But Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams, never accepted it in her heart. She said again and again, "All I know is I won't stop looking until I find him." These weren't just a mother's hopeful words. They were the beginning of a battle that would last the next 17 years. Cheryl's relentless search began to create tension in her relationship with Denise. Denise wanted Cheryl to accept reality and move on. One day, Denise told Cheryl bluntly, "I'm tired of hearing about Mike. I want to move on with my life. If you keep this investigation going, you'll never see your granddaughter again." This was a threat, and sadly, Denise carried it out. Cheryl was blocked from seeing her granddaughter Ansley. But what could stop a mother who refused to believe her son was dead? For 3 years, Cheryl made phone calls, put up signs, wrote letters to Florida's governor every day, compiled her evidence into an evidence book, asked people to post on social media, and reached out to reporters. This was one woman's fight against the whole world.
In June, 6 months after the initial search, we found a set of waders floating. A diver from Tallahassee came over and he dove down in the deeper hole.
Within probably 2 minutes, he came up with a hunting jacket. One sleeve was turned inside out, like someone was trying to get it off. And I put my hand in the pocket and pulled out a hunting license. It said Mike Williams.
Meanwhile, in June 2001, 6 months later, an angler finds a pair of waders floating in the lake. Divers search the lake again and recover a lightly damaged hunting jacket and a flashlight. In the jacket pocket is Mike's hunting license, with his name and signature. These items raised many questions. Neither the boots nor the jacket showed any alligator bite marks, nor did anything look like it had been in the water for 6 months. The boots weren't slimy and the flashlight still worked. This was a huge red flag, but strangely, just a week after this discovery, Denise's lawyer filed a petition in court to have Mike declared dead based on these recovered items. His argument was that alligators or other aquatic animals must have consumed the entire body. The court granted the petition, and Mike's death certificate read, "Date of death, December 16th, 2000. Cause, accidental drowning." The body had still never been found. Was this just a coincidence, or had someone deliberately planted these items in the lake? Later on, this question would become the turning point of the entire story. Cheryl Williams took an important step in her search. She contacted an alligator expert named Matthew Oresco to understand whether alligators could really consume a human body so completely that no trace would remain. Oresco's answer shook the entire foundation of this theory. Oresco explained that alligators don't eat during the cold winter months. When the water temperature drops, an alligator's body focuses on keeping itself warm, and it has no interest in eating. December, when Mike disappeared, was as cold as 14 degrees, completely unsuitable for an alligator to be feeding. In other words, the very theory the whole investigation rested on was simply a false story. Furthermore, Oresco explained that whenever an alligator preys on a human or large animal, forensic evidence always remains, whether bones, marks on clothing, or something else. But in Mike's case, neither forensic evidence nor any sign of violent death was found. In other words, the alligator theory was simply an easy excuse that officials had accepted without much thought. This new revelation brought Cheryl new hope. She now became convinced that her son hadn't drowned, and she pushed her search forward with even more passion and logic. She recorded everything in her notes, every new fact, every new reason, every new question. Finally, after 3 years of continuous effort, Cheryl Williams convinces law enforcement to abandon this ridiculous alligator theory and open a real, official investigation into Mike's disappearance. This was Cheryl's biggest victory, but the real truth was still far away. During the investigation, officers realized they had made many mistakes. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency had spent 735 hours searching just 10 acres of the lake for the body, but hadn't spent a single minute looking for crime scene evidence. Jackson County deputies had never considered other possibilities either. In other words, this case had been mishandled from the very start, and now many crucial pieces of evidence may have been lost forever. As officials began this re-examination, they started noticing some very strange things that no one had ever noticed before. When investigators began looking at this case with fresh eyes, police officer David Arnett, who had been present at the scene that day, said years later that certain things had seemed odd from the very start. First of all, Mike rarely hunted alone, so why did he go alone that day? Second, his truck was found in an undeveloped area from where he'd have had to drag the boat through mud, whereas Mike always used the nearby concrete boat launch. This small detail actually mattered a great deal. Why would a man who always launched his boat the same way suddenly use a difficult and unusual method? The third point was even stranger. There had been a fierce storm that night, and because of the storm, the boat should have drifted toward the east shore, but it was found on the west shore. And most importantly, the boat's engine was off, but the fuel tank was completely full. If Mike had been driving the boat himself and fell out, the boat should have kept running on its own until the fuel ran out. A full tank and a shut-off engine. This wasn't just a sign of an accident. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been part of the search operation, and it was here that they began to suspect Denise Williams and Brian Winchester, because they learned that Winchester had divorced his wife Kathy and married Denise. Along with this, they also learned that Denise had received nearly $2 million from her late husband's insurance policies, and the very policies had been sold by none other than Brian Winchester himself. All these facts together were painting a very suspicious picture. A best friend who was also an insurance agent, a wife who claimed she wanted nothing to do with her ex-husband's death and who did everything she could to stop Cheryl's search, even blocking her from seeing her own daughter. To investigators, all of this was very meaningful, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed evidence. In 2005, Denise and Brian were called in for questioning again. Brian gave his alibi. He said that morning he was asleep at home, 60 miles from the lake, and his ex-wife Kathy could vouch for this. He said he was supposed to go hunting with his father-in-law, but had overslept. Denise's questioning also yielded nothing new. In 2008, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced that Mike's disappearance wasn't an accident, but that he had been a victim of a crime. But with no evidence, no one could be arrested. Everything seemed to have come to a halt, but a mother's courage still hadn't run out, and she decided to take this fight in a new direction. When the official investigation stalled again, Cheryl Williams didn't give up. Because of her efforts, the Discovery Cable Channel made a documentary about Mike's case in 2011, which once again drew people's attention to the matter. But by now, Cheryl had become completely disillusioned with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. She felt they were either incompetent or simply had no interest in the case at all. Starting in 2012, Cheryl Williams began writing a letter every single day to Governor Rick Scott, asking that the case be handed over to a different agency or that a special prosecutor be appointed. This continued for 9 years, during which Cheryl wrote roughly 2,600 letters. Just imagine a mother who, every single day, without tiring, without stopping, kept demanding justice for her son. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was the ultimate expression of a mother's love. Around the same time, in 2012, Denise discovers that Brian is cheating on her. The two separate, and the following year, Denise files for divorce. A few years later, a court order requires the appraisal of their shared home, after which they have no financial ties left between them either. This becomes a major turning point. Brian didn't want the divorce, while Denise didn't want to continue the relationship. The two kept fighting constantly, and the ongoing investigation into Mike's case had also become a continuous source of pressure for both of them. Brian kept calling Denise, but Denise stopped answering his calls. This stress became unbearable for Brian, and then comes the day that changes the course of the entire story. August 5th, 2016. The very day the court-ordered appraisal of their house was scheduled. Denise was leaving her house, heading to work at Florida State University, talking to her sister on the phone, when she saw someone rising up from the back seat of her car. It was none other than Brian Winchester. Brian pressed his loaded gun against Denise's ribs and ordered her to drive straight ahead. He said he did this because Denise wasn't answering his calls. Denise composed herself. She tried to calm Brian down. agreed with everything he said, and promised she'd give their relationship another chance. Brian believed her. Denise also said she would never tell the police about this incident, and with this reassurance, Brian got out of the car, carrying with him brown plastic sheeting, bleach, a spray, and tools. These items alone were proof that Brian had arrived with a truly terrifying intent. Denise immediately called emergency services. Brian was quickly arrested and charged with kidnapping, a first-degree felony in Florida that carries a possible life sentence. He was also charged with domestic violence and armed burglary. The court denied him bail. For Cheryl Williams, this news brought new hope. She told the New York Daily News, "Brian won't let Denise walk around freely with all that money anymore. I pray he tells us what really happened." And Cheryl's prayer was about to be answered. Finally came the moment Cheryl had waited 17 years for. But no one could have guessed just how terrifying the truth would turn out to be. Sitting in jail, Brian Winchester had nothing left to lose. He made a deal with the prosecutor. If he told the truth and pointed to where Mike's body was, he would be spared a life sentence. This deal worked greatly in Brian's favor, and this is where the part of the story that had been hidden for years finally begins. Brian said it all started with his first wife Kathy's betrayal, which planted the seed of revenge in his heart. This same feeling drew him toward Denise, and what started as a one-night event turned into a long, secret affair. Both knew they couldn't live without each other, but divorce wasn't acceptable to Denise, neither because of her social standing, nor because she'd have to share custody of her daughter. This was the point where Mike's hunting accident, in which Brian himself had saved his life, planted a sinister idea in Denise's mind, that perhaps Mike could be permanently removed from the picture. Brian said that in 2000, they began discussing getting rid of both Mike and Kathy. Denise wanted all the blame to fall on Brian, not her, and she wanted it to look like a murder. No, rather an accident, as if fate itself had made the decision, so she could live with this sin. After much deliberation, the two planned a boating accident. They even chose the timing so that Mike's death would occur before the end of December, so they could claim all 3 insurance policies before they expired. Brian called his friend Mike and told him he'd found a great spot for hunting on the shore of Lake Seminole. Brian made sure Mike brought his waders because, according to what he knew, if someone wearing waders falls into the water, they sink very quickly. The plan was to push Mike into the water so it would look like he'd fallen in on his own. But when Brian pushed Mike off the boat, instead of drowning, Mike grabbed onto some stumps and began making his way toward the shore. Brian panicked. Mike was shouting loudly for help. Brian had his shotgun with him. In a panic, without thinking, he shot Mike in the head. Now Brian had very little time left. He had to go home and build his alibi. He needed to appear as though he'd been about to go hunting with his father-in-law. He rushed home, prayed Kathy was still asleep, quietly entered the house, put his phone on the floor, lay down in bed, and called his father-in-law to apologize that he'd overslept. Later, it was Brian himself who hid Mike's body, and sometime afterward he personally planted the hunting cap, boots, license, and flashlight in the lake, so that the searchers would move away from the area and Denise could later be legally declared a widow so she could collect the insurance. The truth had come out, but now the question was, how much did Denise actually know, and how did she manage to hide this lie for so many years? Brian's confession gave the entire story a new direction. He said Denise didn't know that he had shot Mike in the head. Brian said he tried several times to tell Denise the truth, but Denise didn't want to hear it. For her, it was enough to know that her husband was gone. She wanted to live with the belief that this was God's decision, that it was God who had stopped Mike from swimming to shore and let him drown. This way, she could protect herself from the guilt of this sin. In court, Brian also said they did all this because it had become impossible for them to be together. The money was just the cherry on the cake. The real reason was their love and their inability to live without each other. The entire courtroom fell silent hearing this. A story that began with high school love ended with the murder of a friend and 17 years of lies. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to a felony, all three charges carrying potential life sentences. Denise pleaded not guilty to all three charges. But in February 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison. 5 months later, Mike and Denise's daughter Ansley received all the property and insurance money that had previously been given to Denise. In January 2020, Denise Williams appealed her sentence. Her lawyer argued before Florida's First District Court of Appeal that there was no direct evidence linking Denise to the murder itself. In November 2020, the murder charge was overturned, but the 30-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder was upheld. Denise is now imprisoned at the Florida Women's Reception Center, and by the time she's released, she'll be 78 years old. Brian Winchester was sent to Madison Correctional Institute in Florida to serve out the rest of his sentence. His release date has been set for July 30th, 2036, at which point he'll be 67 years old. And Mike and Denise's daughter, Ansley, still believes in her mother's innocence today and places all the blame on Brian Winchester. She refuses to speak to the media and prefers to keep her personal life private. According to Cheryl and her brother, Ansley's uncle, they haven't been able to reconnect with Ansley. Cheryl lost not only her son, but her granddaughter too. A mother who fought lies for 17 years finally saw the truth win, but the price of this victory was immense. Friends, Mike Williams' story teaches us something very important. No matter how powerful a lie is, the truth always eventually comes out. It just takes someone with the passion of a Cheryl Williams to find it. A mother's love, her patience, and her belief. These are the things that finally uncovered a 17-year-old secret. This story isn't just about a murder. It's about the betrayal and greed hidden in human nature, and also about a mother's unbreakable love. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the Who Was channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next stories. Be sure to share your thoughts on this case in the comments section. See you in the next story. Until then, goodbye. I'm Adam, your host.